It's the Doom Antidote Stop.
Good afternoon, Professor Higgins. Are you quite well? Yes, I am all right as well, thank you. My name is Ben, and I'm going to talk about the books that I read in June of 2021. This month I read 6 books, and we have a theme this month, ladies and gentlemen. The theme of this month is transformation. So yes, there's that one. So the first book that I read was a play, and it is A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare. So why did I read this? Well, I read this because I'm going to be in it. Yes, I'm not just an out-of-work actor. I am sometimes an in-work actor, and yes, I'm going to be in a production of this. Yes, so I haven't read this, actually, for a very long time. The last time I did read this was when we did it in drama school, which was a long time ago. It was 13 years ago. So yes, and reading it again was very, very interesting, since I'm going to be in it. So if you're interested, I'm going to be playing Theseus and Oberon. I'm not going to do too much kind of like self-promotion at you, but if you are interested, I'm going to link where it is and stuff in the doodle plunger below. Midsummer Night's Dream. So this is kind of... it is one of the most performed of Shakespeare's plays. It's kind of one of his most popular. It's a comedy. Yeah, it's pretty bonkers. And reading it again, I mean, as I say, I hadn't read it for a long time, and I hadn't seen it for a long time, actually. But I was just reminded about how actually funny it is, and just how much it showcases Shakespeare at his most kind of entertaining. And I think one of the reasons why it's so popular is because it is an ensemble piece. It's a team effort with all the actors, because very often with Shakespeare's you get, the kind of one role parts like the Hamlets and the Lears who kind of carry everything. But this one, it's the whole shebang, it's the whole company of actors, and there's lots of very good parts. So you have 3 kind of groups of characters. You've got the Athenians, the lovers. So you've basically got this kind of triangle, this love square between 4 young lovers. You've got 2 who are eloping. You've got the bloke who's meant to be getting married to the girl who's like running after them, and you've got this other girl who's in love with the guy who's wanting to be in love with the other. And so they all sort of run after each other into the wood. And in the wood is a bunch of fairies. You've got the king and queen of the fairies, Titania and Oberon, and they're basically having a big old barney. They're basically having a custody battle over this changeling child. And yes, things are kind of erupting with them. And then you also have this other group of characters called the Mechanicals, who are this group of kind of working class amateur dramatic actors group who are rehearsing and trying to put on a play for the Duke of Athens, Theseus, and his wife-to-be, Hippolyta. And yes, one of them is called Bottom. And there's a fairy called Puck, who's Oberon's right-hand man, and in trying to do a mission that he sort of bids him to do, he kind of stumbles across this group of mechanicals and kind of transforms one of them into this kind of lovely donkey-headed person. And yes, hilarity ensues. So yeah, so reading it again, I was really sort of struck by how entertaining it is and how funny it is, particularly kind of the one-liners between the lovers. There's a great sort of protracted scene where they're all sort of shouting at each other, and it is really funny. I mean, also, I think one of the reasons why it's so popular is just the potential and the opportunities for physical comedy. It's not kind of like, I don't know, Much Ado or Twelfth Night or Love Labour's Lost, where it's like, it's all about the witticisms, isn't it? For the most part. But this, I mean, there's like opportunities for physical comedy, which is kind of, very accessible in Shakespeare, kind of throughout, really. And yeah, it's kind of got the whole sort of, in terms of Shakespeare's language, it's got kind of a whole gambit. You've got kind of the prose, funny prose with the mechanicals, and then you've got this kind of very, very magical, descriptive stuff with the fairies. These are the forgeries of jealousy and I know a bank speech. So yes, it's kind of very interesting. And this edition, this isn't the edition that we're actually rehearsing from. We're actually rehearsing from the first folio, I think. But I've been reading this one, and this has got a great introduction by Helen Hackett. Yeah, she gives this great introduction about kind of the context of the play and the history of it, and like production history. And one of the things that she was talking about, which I thought was really interesting, Well, first of all, he wrote this. They think that he wrote this around the same time that he wrote Romeo and Juliet, which is kind of like, because, you know, obviously Romeo and Juliet is very and this is very but also, I mean, there's a play within a play in this play, and that is Pyramus and Thisbe. And Pyramus and Thisbe, it kind of echoes a little bit Romeo and Juliet, the kind of star-crossed lovers and sort of, you know, forbidden love sort of thing. But in this, it's sort of sent up. Well, at least the playing of it, the playing of it is sent up. So yeah, and then the other thing is that she does talk about how different productions have kind of focused on different aspects of the play, and if you wanted to, you can. I mean, most productions of this are very kind of family friendly and sort of joyous, and that's the kind of production that I'm going to be in. It's going to be very kind of la la la. But also, you can root this into a very sort of adult world and a very sort of dark world, because there are lots of things in it which are like, I mean, particularly, you know, for example, at the beginning, very beginning, you have a father who wants his daughter to marry this other guy that she doesn't want to be in love with, and if she doesn't, then he wants to kill her, basically. There's a few references, I mean, there's a few characters who kind of reference or kind of even threaten sexual violence. And then you also have this thing about the donkey's head, and how Titania kind of falls in love with him. And kind of in one version, you can just sort of take it as kind of, oh, silly, he's got a donkey on his head and she's falling in love with him. Ha ha ha, how funny. But then you can also kind of go down the route of, well, no, she's falling in love with an animal, and it's all very kind of like, and yes, I think kind of Peter Brook's famous production in The White Cube has kind of gone down that road of kind of potency and yes, bestiality. So yes, it's not just all happy clappy fairies and la-di-da. It's there's some dark things in it, but I mean, that's kind of stuff that you don't have to do. You can very much bypass that. But I just thought it was interesting. So yeah, I'm going to be in it, and it's going to be it's an open air production. It's going to be quite intense, but I'm very much looking forward to it. Theseus, I've played Theseus before. That was at drama school, and yeah, so it's going to be interesting to revisit him. And then Oberon. I mean, I never really thought of myself as an Oberon, but yes, I suppose with this and a bit of As Your Father, whoops banana, I think hopefully I can pull him off. So yes, we shall see. And as I say, I'll link what the deal is down below, because I'm very excited about it, and we shall see what happens. Okay, so because of this, I kind of bypassed a lot of my TBR to kind of accommodate this theme of transformation and sort of magical stuff. So I decided to read books which kind of dealt with those themes, and one of them was this one. Paul takes the form of a mortal girl. Right, so this has been on my periphery for a while. It's I think I heard about it last year, and I was going to pick it up, but then I heard that it was kind of based off Orlando by Virginia Woolf, and so I was like, oh, I probably need to read that. So I read that, but I never got round to this, and now I have. And is it based on Orlando by Virginia Woolf? Well, sort of. It's more based on Ovid, the Metamorphoses, but we shall get to that later. Right, so this is a truly bonkers, weird novel. It's a debut, and basically we have the protagonist, Paul. So he's in his early 20s. It's set in 92 or 1993, I think. And Paul is a shapeshifter, and he can basically change his body, and he can change sex. So he can go from male to female, physically. And not only that, but he can also kind of change his musculature. He can basically change shape. There are a few rules to this, which I thought were interesting, which we shall get to. But essentially, he can change from male to female. Although his default thing is male, Paul. And throughout the novel, he's referred to as he, even when he is female. And basically, I mean, the novel, I mean, this is an example of a picaresque novel, in that it's very episodic. He kind of goes from, relationship. He goes from sexual encounter to sexual encounter. He has a lot of liaisons of that nature. And yeah, it's him kind of thinking that he has a grasp of his own self as this kind of shapeshifter, but then also his kind of his preconceived notions about his identity being tested in specific kind of relationships. And I think there's kind of three main relationships. So, for example, I mean, for a large part of the middle section, he is in this relationship with Diane as a woman. And there's a very interesting kind of theme of consent in this, because, you know, he takes the form of a woman and he enters this lesbian relationship with Diane, and she sort of, you know, she just assumes that he is a woman. And then she finds out, and it's kind of like, ooh, has he been lying to her, or is this just who he is? It's kind of interesting. And yes, and then towards the end, his kind of self-centeredness and his selfishness, because he's a very sort of self-centered person, is really kind of put to the test, and it's sort of, and things happen, which is quite moving, I thought. First of all, this is a queer novel with a capital Q. Paul kind of enters in all these kind of different relationships with and liaisons with lots of different people, different genders and stuff. Yes, it's one of the most sexually explicit novels I've read for a good long while. I was like, oh right, okay, we're getting into that sort of level of description, right? I know my mum watches these videos, so I'm not going to go into detail. But yes, so I have to say that the first sort of 50, maybe to 100 pages or so, I was a bit kind of like, with the writing style, because it felt, if I'm being brutally honest, it did feel like a kind of early draft, because there was some really strange, clunky similes and sort of weird kind of description stuff, which I was like, ooh, that got past an editor. Right, okay. But, I mean, as it gets into the depths of it, Andrea Lawlor, they do seem to kind of get a grip on the voice, on the narrative voice and stuff, and on the structure and stuff. So, I don't know, maybe I'm just being... So yes, it is an interesting one. By the end, I did appreciate it, but there was some things... Oh yeah, the shape-shifting. So there's interesting set of rules and kind of boundaries that Andrea Lawlor kind of places on Paul's shape-shifting. So one of them is he can't change his face too much. So when he is in the shape of a woman, it's like, and people kind of recognise him, it's like, oh, it's okay, I'm his sister, don't worry. So he's not like Mystique, where he can sort of change completely. Discovering that the author is non-binary really kind of made things make sense, because this isn't a transgender novel. This feels like a sort of non-binary, not a non-binary allegory, but just like a kind of, it sort of makes sense where this character is kind of in between. Not for everyone, as I say, it is very, very graphic and it's thick and stuff. But I just thought the themes and the questions that it raises was kind of interesting. So yes, a hymn to the pleasures of gender fluidity, says The Guardian. So yes, check it out if you can stomach fluids and stuff. Descriptions of. Okay, next, so a couple of kind of random charity shop or secondhand bookshop purchases, which sort of have similar, well, not similar themes, but we'll get to it. Okay, so the first one is Memoirs of a Polar Bear. This is by Yoko Tawada, and it is translated by Susan Bernofsky. So this is a Japanese-German author, and this was originally written in German. So this basically details 3 generations of polar bear. It's kind of like a magic realism novel, and before you kind of run away screaming, ah! It's not like magic realism, it's kind of like magic realism, sort of. So you have 3 generations of polar bear. The first one grows up in, I think, Soviet Moscow, and is kind of persuaded to write their memoirs, and they can kind of like walk around and sort of be very kind of humanoid-esque a little bit, but still being a polar bear. And so they write their memoirs, and they become very famous. But because of like censorship and stuff, and writers being sent off to dodgy places and nasty places. She flees to first Canada, and then she goes back to, I think, West Germany, is it? Sorry, East Germany. That's important. So she goes back to East Germany, and there she gives birth to Tosca, who is the second protagonist in the middle. And Tosca becomes a famous dancer, and then she becomes a famous circus performer. And she enters this kind of weird sort of it's a weird kind of lesbian relationship with her human handler. So her son Canute is then taken to Berlin Zoo. She abandons her son Canute, and he's taken to Berlin Zoo. And Canute is then, the last section is basically a sort of a fictionalized version of the real Canute, polar bear in Berlin, who was this very, very famous, who became a very famous attraction for the Berlin Zoo, and had a very sort of tragic end. So that's what we're dealing with, and it's a really kind of interesting look at human nature through the eyes of polar bears, and it's also how we kind of exploit certain sort of performers can be exploited in different ways, and how nature is exploited in various different ways. I can't say that I was gripped all the way through. The middle section, particularly with Tosca, that's narrated by the human handler, and for some reason that just wasn't. It just didn't really kind of get going in the way that the first section did. I thought the first section was really, really good. This kind of magic realism, polar bear walking around Moscow and writing their memoirs and stuff. I thought that was really fabulous. In the third section, without giving anything away, you have this very interesting kind of narrative device, sort of narrative plot twist, maybe, which I thought was like, ooh, all right. Again, I mean, I've been reading books in the past few months about like the GDR and stuff, and this kind of touches on that, which I was sort of surprised by. But yes, what does it say about it? Takes the reader into foreign bodies and foreign climes, and through its beguiling portrait of three extraordinary bears, gracefully reflects upon our own humanity. Yes, I'd agree with that. It is weird. It is very, very strange. And I think like the ghost of Michael Jackson makes an appearance as well. But I love this cover. Isn't it fabulous? But yes, no, I'm glad I picked it up, because it was just really sort of interesting, peculiar read, which I sort of appreciated. Okay, next. So this is another kind of really sort of strange book. So this book, Strange Beasts of China, this is by Yang. Strange Beasts of China. So this book I found sort of, well, first of all, start from the beginning. I'd heard this book we talk about on BookTube a couple of times, and I was like, ooh, I quite fancy that. And I was in the bowels of North Devon, in this sort of random secondhand bookshop, and I came across this copy. And this copy, it's a bit of a dodgy copy, because I'm not sure it was meant to be kind of sold, but it was a secondhand bookshop, so hopefully it's all right. But yes, uncorrected bound proof, not for sale or quotation, but you can talk about it on Twitter. So this book is about a failed zoologist turned famous novelist who goes on a series of kind of investigative adventures through her city, learning more about these very strange beasts. Learning about these different types of beasts that inhabit her city. And the beasts they're all kind of humanoid in form, but they all have kind of differing sort of physical stuff about them, which makes them different from humans. And they all have very interesting names. You have sorrowful beasts, and you have joyous beasts, and impasse beasts, and sacrificial beasts and stuff. And they all have their own kind of characteristics. And each chapter is quite sort of, it's almost like a series of short stories kind of melded with a through line into a novel. But yeah, each kind of chapter or short story begins with an initial description of this strange beast, and then you have the story whereby the protagonist kind of learns more about them, learns about how they're treated or exploited, or how they kind of are a danger or whatever. And then at the end, you have this kind of updated description of the beast. It's a very strange book. It's really dark, this book, and it's quite violent in places. which I was sort of surprised by. I was like, oh! So yeah, it's sort of filled with kind of unlikable characters who kind of want to exploit different things, and it's got a nasty government and stuff. So I was gripped all the way through. I was kind of like, oh! And it's got an interesting sort of history, this book. So initially, it was sort of published serially in a magazine, which kind of explains its kind of short story-esque kind of nature. That was 15 years ago, and it was only in 2020, I think, that it's been translated as a full novel into English. By Jeremy Tiang. And yes, initially Tilted Axis Press published it, but I think it's got a new publisher, and they're kind of republishing it again into a hardcover copy, which looks like a very nice copy. So yeah, sort of interesting history. The ending of it, it does kind of go into sort of, I guess the final message was a bit kind of on the nose and a bit kind of like, yeah, okay, yeah. Who is the real beast? All that sort of stuff. And I was like, okay. But yeah, it was a really fascinating story and fascinating writing, structured really kind of interestingly. It's really dark and really kind of violent, and there's some really sort of really nasty bits in it. But yes, no, I did enjoy it, and I was like, ooh! So yes, Strange Piece of China by Anga, I would recommend it. Yes, if you see it around, because it was interesting. So, before I was cast in the Midsummer Night's Dream, I had about a week where it was sort of being decided. And in that week, I was like, well, I haven't done Shakespeare for a long time, so I better sort of get my head around it again. So I started to read the sonnets, Shakespeare's sonnets again. And I started from the beginning, and I ended up spending the whole month kind of going from cover to cover, reading all of them, which I very much recommend. So I read Shakespeare's sonnets. I love this edition. This is I don't know if it's in print anymore, but it's a very sort of small, kind of nice edition of the sonnets, which I really love, which I've had for years and years and years. And yeah, I would say that if you are going to be doing a Shakespeare play, I would recommend reading the sonnets again, because they just kind of put you into that that sort of Shakespeare mindset again. And because some of them are easier to understand than others, and the really difficult ones to understand, to sort of get your head around, it's sort of it was really valuable for me to kind of really kind of work out what he was saying and the rhythm of those things. Because mostly they're all in the iambic pentameter, and you get kind of clauses which end at the end of a line, and then you get clauses which end in the middle of a line. So it's sort of trying to work out how you perform that with the same, using the rhythm and stuff. So they're very valuable in that regard. But also, just as a reader, as a punter, obviously they are very, very. It's the Shakespeare sonnets. What can I say? So yes, so the sonnets. They're kind of, I guess, the general kind of what people think the Shakespeare sonnets are is the kind of like, oh, should I compare thee to a summer's day and stuff. But this isn't just kind of flowery love poetry. It's about love, but it's about a whole different casket of experiences to do with love. And you have sonnets which are obviously about expressing deep emotional love to someone, but you also have sonnets about jealousy. You have sonnets which talk about remorse, ones which talk about lust, and also you have ones which talk about time and death, and kind of some of the most famous ones, are about this idea of time kind of, decaying our beauty and what that does, and then death and stuff. So yes, I really liked reading these, and there were some which I really liked. Shall I be embarrassing and read some of them? Why not? What is your substance? Whereof are you made, that millions of strange shadows on you tend? Since everyone hath every one shade, and you but one can every shadow lend. Describe Adonis, and the counterfeit is poorly imitated after you. On Helen's cheek all art of beauty set, and you in Grecian tires are painted new. Speak of the spring and foison of the year, and one doth shadow of your beauty show, the other as your bounty doth appear, and you in every blessed shape we know. In all external grace you have some part, but you like none you for constant art. So there's one sort of really difficult one which I do quite like. Oh, when in disgrace, there we go, there's that one. So some of the more difficult ones, I mean, I really like this one because it's kind of just really difficult to understand, but I thought it was interesting. So he says, this is number 24, so he says, "Mine eye hath played the painter and hath stelled thy beauty's form in table of my heart. My body is the frame wherein 'tis held, and perspective it is best painter's art. For through the painter must you see his skill, to find where your true image pictured lies, which in my bosom's shop is hanging still, that hath his windows glazed with thine eyes. Now see what good turns eyes for eyes have done. Mine eyes have drawn thy shape, and thine for me are windows to my breast, where through the sun delights to peep, to gaze therein on thee," in his heart. "Yet eyes this cunning want to grace their art, they draw but what they see, know not the heart." Then there's one which I really love, which is about lust. So this is number 129. So he goes, "The expense of spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action. And till action, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust, enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight. Past reason hunted, and no sooner had, past reason hated, as a swallowed bait on purpose laid to make the taker mad. Mad in pursuit and in possession so, had, having, and in quest to have, extreme. A bliss in proof and proved a very woe, before a joy proposed behind a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well, to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell." So yes, plenty of fun and games with that. "Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds." Okay, and lastly, we have a very important text of the Western canon. We have Ovid's Metamorphoses. Metamorphoses. So I read this because I read somewhere, well, I read in Helen Hackett's introduction that Shakespeare was very much influenced by this. Oh, sorry. Particularly that he lifted the play within the play, Pyramus and Thisbe, from this. And then also, yeah, apparently it's very, very influential and stuff. And it's about this thing about transformation. So I thought, oh, I'll give it a read. Oh, right, so Ovid was a Roman poet who did know it. And this is basically his retellings of Greek myths and Roman myths that are to do with transformation, with things changing, people or things changing into different things or animals or whatever. And yes, and it kind of goes from the beginning of creation stories, right the way through to when a new, what's it called? A new leader is put into power, so Augustus is placed into power. So yes, it's got a very high, dense mass, this book. It's kind of filled with stories. It's like, I think, 200 stories or something like that. Now, it's kind of, this is wild, this book. It's really, really like a lot. So it's talking about these people who are transformed into other things as a result of the sort of the worst or the kind of the most kind of heightened extremities of human experience. So you get people who are transformed into different things because, you know, they want revenge, or they're trying to sort of escape with their lives or whatever. And yeah, it's about the sort of the very the cruel, capricious nature of humanity and the transformations that happen because of that. So one of the things, I mean, it's interesting because there are lots of kind of well-known myths in this, but it's interesting what the things that Ovid chooses to kind of to dwell on and what he chooses to kind of glance over. So for instance, like Theseus and the Minotaur is kind of really sort of briefly mentioned. The labours of Hercules are briefly mentioned, but then like other things, like there's this really sort of long protracted section with centaurs getting drunk and causing a massive fight, sort of Game of Thrones Red Wedding kind of fight thing. And that goes on for like sort of 6 or 7 pages. And it's also kind of interesting and kind of quite disturbing, I guess, the ways in which people transform. So there are a lot of stories about women trying to flee these men trying to ravish them. A lot of the book, a huge amount of the book is about, I guess, sort of overpowering sexual drive or lust, which kind of makes people do nasty things, particularly to women, but also you have women who do the same thing to men, sort of. But yeah, there are so many stories about women trying to flee, and either they transform as a way of escaping. So you have this one nymph who sort of transforms into a tree in order to escape the clutches of this bloke. And then the other kind of transformation in that context is you get this sort of like victim punishing. You get the women who have been ravished getting punished for it by Juno, who's jealous or whatever. So yeah, and so they are transformed into something which obviously is not very pleasant to read. But yeah, it's like detailing the really sort of cruel and nasty side of, yes, gods and goddesses, but reflected through that human nature. So yeah, and not only that, I mean, there's one really vicious and nasty, gruesome story in this sort of context, which you can definitely see if you've read Titus Andronicus by Shakespeare. You can see that he's sort of lifted some of those sort of plot elements and put into Titus Andronicus. I was like, oh gosh. But yeah, if you take it as a book which is about the cruel, nasty, sort of worst aspects of human nature, sort of in classic verse form, then hopefully you can sort of read it with some distance. So yeah, so this translation, it's one from the 50s, I believe, and it's translated by Mary Innes, I think, and it's a prose translation. And I think the prose translation, I didn't mind the prose translation. I mean, the beginning is amazing. I mean, this opening paragraph: my purpose is to tell of bodies which have been transformed into shapes of a different kind. You heavenly power, since you are responsible for those changes and for all else, look favourably on my attempts and spin an unbroken thread of verse from the earliest beginnings of the world down to my own times. So I was like, ooh, that's good. But for the rest of it, I mean, prose translation of this, it kind of works and it kind of doesn't, because it's so dense. It makes the reading experience really kind of not laborious, but it makes it so dense. And I think if it was a verse translation, I think it would just give the whole thing time to breathe more, I think, is my reasoning. So I do want to, fairly soon, I think, read a verse translation of this. And when I say fairly soon, I mean like sort of maybe sort of this year, sort of just reread the Metamorphoses just in a verse translation. So yes, but it's a very important text, and for some people they really, really love it. And I can see, you sort of read through certain bits and you're like, oh, I can see, where some like Shakespeare and stuff has been inspired and stuff. As I say, I mean, I think I wasn't kind of in love with this translation, although some of it is. I wasn't in love. I appreciated the translation, but I just don't think it suits a prose. I just don't think it suits prose. I think verse is what is really going to help me to kind of get into it more. So I think I will do that. Also, I completely forgot to mention, and I wanted to mention, near the end there is this section, I think it's called The Teachings of Pythagoras, and in it he kind of talks about the transformations that happen in kind of everyday life. So the whole poem, you've been reading about these kind of magical mythological things about people changing into animals and trees and stuff, and then suddenly you get this section where he's talking about the everyday transformations that happen in nature and in the universe, how things just change, how things change in nature all the time, how we change all the time, we age and stuff. And so I really appreciated that kind of that shift into this stuff happens all the time in nature and in the universe. And there was a real kind of like almost like a kind of pantheistic type element to it, which I sort of appreciated. Also, if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you might like that final section as well, because he says you don't eat meat. So yes, but yes, I just thought I'd add that. So there we go. Thank you for watching. This has been my June wrap-up. And yeah, anything else? No, I don't think so. I hope everyone is all right. I hope you had a good Pride Month, if you were so disposed to do so. And yes, I shall see you very soon. Bye-bye.